everybody, I'm Jeff Wall, and today we are counting down for you the top 5 fights that never happened. You know, as MMA fans, we've been blessed with some amazing fights, but there's been a few that have slipped through our fingers that have left us wondering, what if? Which is why we thought, what are some of the best fights to have never happened? This sort of thing happens all the time in MMA and combat sports in general for multiple reasons, whether it's injury issues, fighter, promoter, or contract negotiation issues. For whatever reason, the MMA gods have denied us of these great matchups time and time again.
We based the rankings on 4 categories we felt most important to this topic: the overall likelihood, the perceived competitiveness at the time, fan interest, and does the fight stand the test of time. We're also not doing any fights that just simply didn't happen when we wanted them to, i.e. Chuck Liddell versus Anderson Silva.
But before I start, just remember to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Lingo Sports to make sure you don't miss a single video. Now, number 5, we have Ronda Rousey versus Cyborg. This one is a legendary fight and a legendary beef that never got settled, and it goes all the way back to their days as champions in Strikeforce.
Aside from her first pro MMA fight, Cyborg was nothing but absolutely dominant. She wrecked the competition. Her otherworldly strength, power, and pace combined with her incredible skill in all areas gave her opponents no chance in the cage.
But as with all dominant champions, fans want to see them challenged, or maybe in some cases even dethroned, and that is where Ronda Rousey came in.
Rousey, undefeated at 7-0, captured the bantamweight belt after beating Miesha Tate in 2012. She was dispatching her opponents even faster and arguably more impressive than Cyborg was. So she called her out.
First of all, I need to send out a challenge to Miss Cyborg out there. People want to see that the first fair fight of your life? I'm the champ now. The champ doesn't go to you. You come to the champ. Come down to 135 and let's settle this.
Which is kind of a dumb call out. Cyborg had a tough time making 145 as it was, and Rousey had competed at a catchweight of 150. Nonetheless, Rousey continued to antagonize Cyborg even after the UFC had purchased Strikeforce and Cyborg was over in Invicta.
I don't care, I love fight, I love pushing face, and let's go train hard and try to make 135, 140 for fight Ronda Rousey. Stop run.
Both of them wanted this fight, and it was clear. This one was personal, and the UFC was starting to realize there was really nothing left to do for Ronda Rousey.
The UFC reached an agreement with the all-time great, but Cyborg wanted a few test runs at making 140 before she even tried 135, and yes, that was very ugly. So with Cyborg unable to make 135 and Rousey's outright refusal to even try a catchweight or move up, this fight was no longer in the cards, and it gets a score of 2 out of 5 for likelihood. It was and should have been relatively competitive, but tough to know what fighters would have been stepping in the cage with weight cutting issues, so it gets a 3 out of 5 for competitiveness. The fans, hardcore or otherwise, were pumped for this one, so 3 out of 3 for fan interest, and a 1 out of 2 for standing the test of time, as Holm sort of laid out a similar blueprint that Cyborg and Camp would have probably laid out.
Now for another one that didn't make the cut. Dan Henderson versus Chuck Liddell. When the UFC purchased Pride, Dan Henderson was the current welterweight and middleweight champion. And yes, that's right people, there was someone who held 2 belts in 2 different weight classes before Conor McGregor.
Liddell was the longtime UFC 205-pound king, and one of the sport's first superstars. Henderson was coming off an infamous KO win over the axe murderer Anderson Silva, inserting himself into one of those dream Pride versus UFC matchups back in the day. And it was almost a reality too. But anyone watching at the time knows Chuck Liddell's title reign was mostly filled with revenge matchups, fighters he had lost to or had beef with. And this time he was trying to get revenge on Quinton Rampage Jackson, which didn't go so well for Liddell. Liddell was a shell of himself after the devastating KO loss. Henderson, meanwhile, would go on to lose to Rampage and Anderson Silva. This fight could have been crazy. Both had eerily similar styles, wrestling backgrounds, powerful right hands, and iron chins with a tendency to brawl. But fan interest wasn't as high as some others. Some also might argue Henderson could have done what Rampage did. But it's a matchup of two legends that never happened. And how the UFC just didn't book this one in the first place is beyond me. But either way, it does not make the list.
So, unfortunately, Hendo does not get to represent Team Quest on this countdown. But another fighter does, and he comes in at number 4. Randy Couture versus Fedor Emelianenko. There have been so many fights through the years that so many diehard fight fans have wanted to see Fedor Emelianenko fight in. From 2003 to 2010, he wasn't just considered to be the best heavyweight at the time, he was considered to be probably the best the sport had ever seen at that point in time.
At the end of the Pride era, Fedor was a free agent and continued to compete outside the UFC. The UFC and Fedor's management failed to work out a deal, which has been a continued theme in Fedor's career. Meanwhile, in the UFC, Randy Couture came out of retirement in 2007 and defied Father Time again by winning back the UFC heavyweight belt and defending it. He later decided he wanted a challenge, and that was in Fedor. But he was going to have to make it happen on his own. He walked into the ring after the event Affliction Banned, where Fedor had just submitted Tim Sylvia for the WAMA heavyweight belt. The fighters had their stare down, and the MMA world was ready for a dream fight to take place.
Fight fans were dying for this one. It was 2 of the best 3 heavyweights ever. It was USA versus Russia, Fedor Sambo versus Randy Couture's Greco-Roman wrestling. I mean, you couldn't write this one any better.
Both fighters wanted it. Affliction wanted it. The MMA world seemed to want it. They even had a photo shoot to promote the fight. But Dana White and the UFC had Couture under contract and were not in the cross-promotion business. This one gets a 2 for likelihood since the fighters wanted it, but the contract meant it really didn't have a good chance of happening. 4 for competitiveness. The fans were hyped, so that's a 3. And 2 out of 2 for standing the test of time. I think most of us are still upset we lost that one, and I think it still would have been a very competitive fight, looking back on it.
For our next honorable mention, we go down from the heavyweights to the flyweights, where Demetrious Johnson reigns supreme. It's DJ versus TJ Dillashaw.
With the introduction of the flyweight division, Demetrious Mighty Mouse Johnson was making his bid as being one of the best fighters to ever set foot in the sport. During his time in the UFC, Johnson made fighting look easy, like he was fighting in the Matrix. DJ reeled off 7 finishes during what should be 13 title defenses.
And yeah, that's right. It should be 13 title defenses. I'm looking at you, MMA judging. But just a weight class up, TJ Dillashaw was catching bodies just the same, and both were looking for a big money fight.
For Mighty Mouse, he wanted this to be his big payday. Discussions began in 2017, and the hardcores were stoked to see 2 great champions willing to risk it. TJ would drop down to 125 to challenge Demetrious, but Johnson wanted Dillashaw to respect the division and make sure he could make the weight in the first place by taking 1 fight at 125 before a title fight.
And that is where it all started to unravel. DJ would lose his title due to a terrible decision, and yes, I'm talking to you again, MMA judging system.
In the end, the UFC didn't really seem that interested in the fight overall. TJ would make the move down to 125, but was incredibly drained and was KO'd by Henry Cejudo, tested positive for EPO. Mighty Mouse was traded to 1 for Ben Askren. If Mike Goldberg were narrating the events of this one, this is the part where he would say, "It's all over!"
And coming in at number 3, 2 former WEC champs who were the next big things in the sport.
When the UFC merged the WEC roster with theirs, it didn't have a 135 or 145 pound men's division, so Aldo and Dominic Cruz were inaugural champions. However, the UFC already had their own lightweight champion in Frankie Edgar, so Pettis would have to work his way up the ladder. Pettis did stumble out of the gate, losing to Clay Guida via unanimous decision, but got back on the winning track and was on a 3-fight winning streak with some trademark wins over Joe Lozon and Donald Cerrone. Pettis was back to the phenom we all thought he was. Jose Aldo was busy at 145 defending his title. The Brazilian was on an incredible 14-fight win streak with wins over Mike Brown, Mark Hominick, Kenny Florian, Chad Mendes, and Frankie Edgar. Aldo was practically untouchable. So, in 2013, Pettis and Aldo started teasing the idea of a fight for Aldo's 145-pound belt. The two were scheduled for UFC 163, but Pettis was forced to pull out of the bout due to a knee injury. The next card, he would eventually take the place of Pat Healy in a title fight versus Benson Henderson in Pettis' hometown of Milwaukee. Pettis won the belt, and both fighters were more concerned about solidifying their legacies at their own weight classes. Fight fans were dying for this one. MMA striking was taking massive leaps, and these two were a massive part of that. Pettis, with his flashy and dangerous array of unorthodox kicks and speed grappling style, versus Aldo's incredible athleticism, defensive genius, and great ground game. It was the future of MMA, and everybody wanted to see it.
Of course, hindsight is 2020, but when you really look back on it, Pettis got exposed a lot by his bad footwork and subpar defense by strikers that probably didn't even have as much skill as Aldo did. Plus, when he did eventually cut down to 145, he wasn't really himself, and Aldo likely would have torn through him.
So this one gets a 5 out of 5 for likelihood, 3 out of 3 for fan appeal, 4 out of 5 for competitiveness, but realistically doesn't stand the test of time, so 1 out of 2 for that. But it was fun while it lasted.
Now, for our next honorable mention, it's the two guys who took the belts off of Aldo and Pettis. Conor McGregor versus Rafael dos Anjos. Conor McGregor was just coming off his 13-second knockout of Jose Aldo, so he set his sights on the 155-pound belt and Rafael dos Anjos.
RDA had just finished mauling Anthony Pettis and Donald Cerrone, but Dos Anjos had to pull out of this one due to a foot injury. The UFC found a replacement for him who would prove to be the thorn in McGregor's side. That, of course, was Nate Diaz. McGregor would lose that one. Dos Anjos would end up losing his title by TKO to Eddie Alvarez, and it seemed like both McGregor and the UFC don't really have any interest in the bout and maybe never really did. But this fight does stand the test of time in our eyes. Dos Anjos posed a lot of problems for McGregor, and the style matchup of two aggressive strikers would make anyone salivate. But it doesn't make the top 5 due to fan interest and seemingly only booked for McGregor to get that second belt.
Coming in at second place on the countdown is Alistair Overeem versus Fedor Emelianenko. When Affliction fell apart and Dream wasn't able to really get off the ground, Fedor needed a new home to keep kicking ass. Luckily for him, the best heavyweight roster wasn't actually in the UFC at the time. It was in Scott Coker's California-based promotion, Strikeforce.
On the roster was the likes of Andrei Arlovsky, Bigfoot Silva, Fabricio Werdum, an undefeated Brett Rogers, and the current champ Alistair Overeem. Overeem, a long-time gangly journeyman light heavyweight, needed a change because, well, he was kind of getting beat up on a little bit. So he hit the weights. All of a sudden, Overeem was born. He was already an incredibly well-rounded and experienced fighter. But when he added a real strength and conditioning program to his regime and moved up to the land of the heavyweights, he became a juggernaut that would put the fear of God into anyone locked in a cage with him. He was kicking so much ass, he had to get into more kickboxing fights in K1 to satisfy his hunger. Between 2007 and 2011, Overeem's consistency is something that almost no heavyweight has ever managed. I mean, that's kind of like general consistency, but it's much more than that. He racked up 9 MMA wins, 9 kickboxing wins, 12 total KOs, 16 total finishes, and the Strikeforce, Dream, and K1 Grand Prix heavyweight titles. That should give you a good idea of how good the Demolition Man was. Then, Fedor signed with Strikeforce in 2009, and fight fans began to salivate at the idea of the two colliding. At 31, Fedor was still considered undefeated. That one loss was a fight that was stopped due to a cut, and to that point, had shown next to no signs of vulnerability. Fedor made his debut and handed Brett Rogers his first loss by KO, but he was starting to show some chinks in his armor. Funny enough, Overeem made sure that his presence was felt when he returned to Strikeforce and beat upon Brett Rogers too. Negotiations between an actual fight seemed to stall though, so he faced off against Fabricio Werdum. In the first round, Emelianenko sent Werdum to the canvas and seemed to have him hurt. Emelianenko jumped into Verdum's guard and was quickly submitted by the black belt. Fedor's unbeatable aura was damaged. Most demanded an immediate rematch with Werdum after the massive upset.
Pause. Quick pop quiz. What do nostalgic MMA fans love more than anything? The answer is a Grand Prix, and that's exactly what Strikeforce did. They set up a heavyweight Grand Prix with Fedor Emelianenko on one side facing Bigfoot Silva, and on the exact same side of the bracket, Alistair Overeem versus Fabricio Werdum in set up what was sort of a revenge match, but really more likely a don't let Fabricio Werdum get to Fedor fight.
It was some great matchmaking by Coker and matchmaker Rich Chow to ensure they could get the fights everyone wanted out of the two. And more importantly, make it hard for either team to negotiate their way out of things. Fedor versus Bigfoot was the first matchup of the tournament, and another big upset was dealt by Bigfoot. Beating up on the smaller Fedor from full mount, the damage was so bad the cage side doctors called an end to it. And in doing so, called an end to most fan interest with back-to-back losses, an end to what could have been an amazing matchup. Overeem and the rest of the Strikeforce roster, like so many other competitors, was bought by the UFC. Fedor, as always, stayed away from the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and this one would never come to pass. And it's a real shame. Regardless if you think Fedor may have been heading towards the end, this one was probably the best matchup we've ever had looking back on it. Fedor's advantages were always in his experience, massive skill differential he had almost over every single heavyweight, and of course, his speed. Overeem had those things, and in some cases, maybe even more, plus a size, reach, and power advantage to go on top of all of that. Think about it, Fedor's Sambo versus the Demolition Man's ferocious clenched knees and submissions. And of course, no matter how big he got, Overeem's chin was never getting any stronger, and Fedor never had trouble finding a big man's chin. As far as scoring this one goes, as usual, Fedor's management seemed to get in the way of this fight too much, so it gets a 3 out of 5 for likelihood, a 3 out of 3 for interest, a 5 out of 5 for competitiveness, and a 2 out of 2 for standing the test of time.
Now, before we get to number 1, we have one more honorable mention, and a lot of you are probably wondering how this one isn't on the list, and maybe some of you would argue that this should be number 1. Well, you can get to that in the comments, but for now, I'm going to tell you our last honorable mention is Anderson Silva versus George St. Pierre. Some of you are probably even so mad right now that you probably want to turn off the video, but just hear me out, and for those who don't know about this one, let me fill you in.
For a long time, the sport had 2 or 3 pound-for-pound kings consistently in the conversation as the best pound-for-pound of all time. Fedor, of course, was one, and the other two were GSP and Anderson the Spider Silva. Before Silva's reign as middleweight champion, he was the guy who did the Michael Jackson walkout in Pride. And in Japan, he didn't have a ton of success. He was actually one of the weaker fighters coming out of the famous Shooter Box camp. But when he changed teams to Team Nogueira and entered the UFC in 2006, it all changed and a legend was born. Silva was untouchable, and even as he would feel out his opponents for the first couple of minutes, you always knew his touch of death was coming. For 8 straight fights, no one could even make it out of the second round with Silva. Just a weight class below, a superstar was fulfilling his potential, George St. Pierre, dethroning longtime champion Matt Hughes, and despite a stumbling block to Matt Serra, GSP came back from that stronger and better than ever. St. Pierre dominated the shark-infested waters of the welterweight division for nearly 9 years. Fans and UFC President Dana White wanted a super fight between the sport's best. Although GSP would have been considerably outsized, St. Pierre was one of the few fighters at the time with a well-rounded game and some amazing grappling, which had been shown to be Silva's Achilles heel. The only problem was this fight never really even came close to being signed. GSP wanted to focus on beating the many challengers at 170, and you can see why. These guys kept coming even after George was gone. He also noted many times that he wasn't even a big welterweight and he would have to change his body in order to even conclude he would be healthy at 185. As for Silva, he felt the same about his division and was too big to cut down past 185.
Ultimately, this one never even came close. There was no weight class established, the fighters clearly were not that into it at all, and GSP actually ended up having some health problems when he went up to 185 when he fought Michael Bisping. So, look, this one was never going to happen. So stop talking about it. Alright, finally, we've gotten to it. Our number one fight that never happened. You probably already know, and if you didn't guess it, come on, it's obvious. It's Tony Ferguson versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now, before I get into this one, I'm just going to read you something really quick from the dictionary. Curse. The expression of a wish that misfortune, evil, doom, etc. befall a person, group, etc. And that, my friends, describes this one perfectly. Let me explain.
Alright, let me just get it out of the way and let you know that this one got a perfect 15 out of 15 for us. As we know, Khabib Nurmagomedov is undefeated. You know the sambo I keep talking about? The sambo that Fedor used that no one could stop? Well, add some bear training to that at a young age and times that advantage by about 1,000,000. Khabib is an animal, and to this day has been staking his claim as the best fighter to ever walk the earth. The man hasn't even lost a goddamn round in 28 pro fights. Ferguson, after getting a shot in the big leagues after winning the Ultimate Fighter, at one point really didn't look like anything more than a solid gatekeeper with a funky style and attitude. But he became impossible to dismiss on a 6-fight win streak in the most stacked division in MMA history. Khabib, with 6 straight UFC wins of his own, was not shy about talking smack to anyone. The same could be said for Ferguson. These two truly feared no man.
So, they were matched up at the TUF 22 finale. But after rehabbing some knee injuries and some obvious intense training, Khabib would end up having to pull out with broken ribs, and Tony Ferguson would end up having to fight Edson Barboza as a fill-in, winning a dogfight by a Darce choke victory. Now, that is fight cancellation number 1.
The two were matched up again on the main card of UFC Fox 19. This time, Ferguson had to pull out with blood in his lungs during training.
Now, that is some intense cardio. But it's also fight cancellation number 2.
Khabib would instead dominate a replacement in Daryl Horcher en route to a TKO win. He would later beat down Michael Johnson whilst telling him he deserved a title shot more than him.
You have to give up. You know this, I yourself.
Ferguson would also add 2 more wins to his streak with a submission win over Lando Venata and dicing up RDA for 5 straight rounds sky high in Mexico City. And even with the fighter's sights set on championship gold and a money fight with Conor McGregor, the current champ at the time, fans still wanted Khabib versus Tony. The idea of the two never meeting was too much to bear.
I mean, of course, you had these two guys on these amazing long win streaks. And of course, there's always that question of, can Tony Ferguson's unorthodox ground game challenge Khabib? Because we've never seen it before. And it was a fight that fans wanted to see above pretty much everything else. And just when you thought a man's lungs filled with blood was weird, check this one out. These two were once again scheduled to fight again at UFC 209. But then there were complications with Khabib's weight cut. This time the culprit was some tiramisu. And yes, I hope you're keeping count because that is fight cancellation number 3.
Whoever said 3rd time's the charm should have told that to these two. But wait, there's more. Ferguson would eventually win the interim belt by submitting Kevin Lee with a triangle choke at UFC 216. Ferguson's unbeaten run was now at 10 wins in a row. Khabib extended his undefeated record to 25-0 with a 5-round mauling of Edson Barboza. With barely anyone left to fight, despite the public outcry of this fight being cursed, the UFC was really left with no choice. The two were scheduled for a title fight for the first time at UFC 223.
All right, so at this point, you probably think you've seen it all. I mean, we had Khabib breaking his rib, Tony and his lungs filled with blood. We had the weight cut issues with tiramisu. I'm sure you're definitely thinking that absolutely nothing could surprise you at this point. You've seen it all. Let me tell you, you're wrong. And you're not even going to believe me when I tell you what happened next. On fight week, Tony Ferguson tripped and tore his goddamn ACL. Yes, that is fight cancellation number 4, and trust me when I tell you, that is a thing that happened.
But don't worry, it's not all bad news. Nurmagomedov would fight Ally Quinta instead and win the vacant lightweight title. So Nurmagomedov finally got UFC gold. He even got the title fight with McGregor he always wanted. And Ferguson would extend his streak to 12 wins in a row.
Which brings us to April 9th, 2020, where it took a global pandemic known as COVID-19 to sabotage our dreams for a 5th straight time. It just seems like the MMA gods really don't want this one to happen. But anyway, that's our countdown. So if you thought I was wrong in this one, or any of us at Lingo Sports were, let us know in the comments below, and we'll get back to you.